Let's bring in Trudy McIntosh now. Trudy, a fourth portfolio may have already emerged. Talk us through that.
Laura, the former Prime Minister's recollection was about to be jogged with this bombshell report we've seen come out from the Australian Associated Press this morning. They have found documents, a paper trail showing that Mr Morrison also had himself signed off in terms of an administrative order. We can show you here. They've got the receipts. That on the 28th of June, in the middle of last year, Mr Morrison also took over powers in terms of social services. Now, this would be the fourth portfolio responsibility that Mr Morrison assumed in the course of the pandemic. He has mounted his defence on 2GB this morning, but incredibly, he was specifically asked about social services on Ben Fordham. Did you assume responsibility for this role? He initially says no, but take a look at what he says.
Are there any other portfolios that you assumed any control over?
Not to my recollection, Ben. I'm pursuing that, but not to my recollection. There were a number that were considered at the time for safeguard reasons.
Did you take control of social services at any point?
No.
Or assume any powers around social services?
Not to my knowledge, no. Okay. But I certainly didn't exercise any, Ben.
So the former Prime Minister says there, not to his knowledge did he take over other responsibilities, but the paperwork that we've seen, according to AAP, seems to indicate otherwise. The then Minister at the time was Anne Ruston. Sky News has already put in a request to Miss Ruston. Did she know that Mr Morrison had assumed this power, or unlike a lot of her colleagues, was she simply unaware that this administrative change had been made? The current Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has been speaking in the media as well this morning. He was also unable to say, after his briefings he received yesterday from the head of his department, whether there is more portfolios. They are going through the paperwork, and he will get an additional briefing this morning, promising to provide an update after that.
Are you aware of this, Prime Minister?
No, I'm not aware of that particular detail, but I'll be receiving a briefing this morning shortly, and I'll have more to say later this morning.
Scott Morrison says the reason why these portfolios were not made public is because he hadn't exercised the powers. This is in reference to the health and finance portfolios. They were taken at the very start of the pandemic, Mr Morrison says, as a safeguard or a check and balance, a redundancy in Mr Morrison's words. Take a look at his justification, though, when pressed on why he couldn't just tell the Australian people.
Because, Ben, it was there only as a safeguard and it wasn't needed. If I had to trigger it, then of course I would have. But it wasn't triggered. And the ministers, I should stress, were continuing to run their portfolios without interference every single day.
Now, that might be the case for finance and health, but that does not explain why the resources portfolio was not ever told to the public. This was only revealed in the wake of this book being published at the weekend. In the resources role, Laura, Mr Morrison did make a decision. He overturned Keith Pitt's inclination when it came to the PEP 11 gas exploration licence. So in that very instance, he did make a decision as minister, and by his very own logic, he should have made that public, but didn't.
Yeah, and he said, actually, I sought to be the decision maker in that process because it is something that he could actually have oversight of, and the Cabinet technically didn't. But goes back to that fundamental question. Yes, you're the chief, you're the big cheese, you're the Prime Minister, but what is the point of having ministers or a Cabinet government if you are going to ride roughshod without some of these ministers knowing on huge decision-making processes that should be made around the Cabinet table?
And Laura, there is a lot of responsibilities that are actually delegated away from a Prime Minister to ministers on things like environmental approvals. That is the sole decision of the Environment Minister. It's not for the Prime Minister to necessarily make that decision. So this is a complicated situation that the former Prime Minister now finds himself in by going on and trying to make this lengthy defence this morning. He's essentially now opened a cans of worms with mismatched logic here on the different decisions he did and didn't want to make when he was secretly acting as the minister.
Yes, not a presidential system we need to remind ourselves this morning. Trudy, thank you. We'll check in soon.